Today we get to grips with the NEX-C3, we wrap up our discussion on episode 1 around exposure, and we briefly answer a listener's question. I'm Tristan Hall and welcome to the third episode of Alpha Tutorials. Before we begin the podcast today, we just want to briefly clarify a statement which was made or some confusion that was created in episode 2 around the Alpha 35. We went back and tested the cameras, the Alpha 35 against the 33 again, and we came to some different conclusions. The 35 definitely does have an advantage in low light conditions, and it certainly does have certain benefits that you wouldn't necessarily pick up as easily in day-to-day shooting like we did until we got into really testing them side by side. Which brings us back to the point that we made. Sony South Africa have confirmed that the Alpha 35 will launch at a retail price of about 6,500 Rand. The Alpha 33 launched at a higher price when it came onto the market, so that is some good news. But there are some very good deals on the 33 at the moment out there. And what we were really trying to say in last week's or the last episode was that while the 35 has got some improvements, the differences are not huge to notice on a day-to-day basis, and you could do really well by getting a 33 at the current pricing out there. So don't write off the option, but at the same time, we weren't trying to shoot down the Alpha 35. Today we're going to take a look at the NEX-C3. This is one of Sony's mirrorless cameras. Now, it's important for us when we're discussing about mirrorless cameras to define what it is. There's a lot of discussion around mirrorless out there in the market, but I've come to see on an individual basis that people aren't quite sure what we're talking about when we're talking about a mirrorless camera. A conventional SLR camera has within it a mirror which bounces light from the lens into an optical viewfinder, except in the case of the SLT cameras like the 35, 55 and the 33. Now, when that happens, when we take a photograph, the mirror moves out of the way and the light hits the sensor, we get our image. The mirror allows us to see what the lens is seeing, allows us to focus through the lens and do everything so that we have a clear idea of what the image is going to be like. But the problem with that mirror is it makes the camera considerably chunkier. So what Sony have done by taking the mirror out of their camera, and there's a few cameras like this on the market, is made the camera a lot more compact. Now, the NEX-C3 doesn't give you poorer image quality. It has the exact same sensor in it as the 35 has. So it's important to realize that you're getting an SLR quality image, but out of a body which doesn't have the mirror. And that's the only difference. The other thing is that mirrorless cameras, because they are smaller and the distance light has to travel to the sensor is less, lenses can be designed a bit smaller as well. So you have a really nice package for travel purposes. Also, without the mirror needing to move out of the way, these cameras can quite easily attain speeds of 7 frames a second. The NEX-C3 replaces the NEX-3, one of Sony's first mirrorless models. It was introduced the same time as the NEX-5, and they've made some great improvements and enhancements on the camera. The NEX-3 was never quite a comfortable camera in the hand. It was very edgy. They've rounded things off quite nicely on the C3, and it fits nicely in the hands. It's a bit smaller than the NEX-3 was, and the handling is really good with the new firmware. What we also enjoy is the battery life is better on the NEX-C3, and overall the image quality has improved. The only downside to it for some people out there are going to be the guys that are very big into videography. This will give you a 720 MPEG-4 video file, whereas the NEX-5 is still the only one that offers 1080 AVC HD. So if you're big into your video, you may still want to take the step up to the NEX-5. But previously, where I would have told people go for the NEX-5 because it's better built and handles better than the 3 does, the C3 changes that. And if stills is your main priority, you can't go wrong with this NEX-C3. It's a fantastic camera. So do yourself a favor, as it hits the shelves in the coming weeks, go out there, test it out, get familiar with it. It's fantastic. I don't think you would be disappointed. We want to take a look at our tutorial section, and as I said in the beginning, wrap up what we discussed in episode 1 around exposure. Remember in episode 1 we spoke about the aperture, the shutter, and about ISO. Pardon me. Now, if you have a situation where you are not familiar with these things, you may be watching us for the first time, do yourself a favor, go back and watch episode 1, and also go to alphatutorials.co.za and go and read the in-depth articles around aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Today what we're going to talk about, though, is the other factors that your aperture, ISO, and shutter control when you're creating an image. Let's kick off with shutter speeds. Shutter speeds control not only the amount of light hitting the sensor, but by virtue of that, how much motion blur there's going to be if our subject is moving, as well as how much camera shake we could have. Now, it's important to realize that when you're trying to get a creative result, you want to use your shutter speed to achieve that result. Perhaps, for example, if you're photographing motorsports, you want to be able to freeze the car going around the track, but you at the same time don't want to freeze everything about the car that it looks like it was parked on the track. So using the right balance of shutter speed, let's say in the region of a 2/50th or 500th of a second, will allow the bigger body of the car, which is perceived to be moving slower, to be frozen, but the wheels, which are turning at a much higher rate than the car's moving, will still have a bit of blur in it, and so it does give that perception of motion in your image. Shutter speed is very important also for controlling your camera from a camera shake perspective. And the bigger your lens is, the more chance you're going to have of getting camera shake. If you're using a camera, any camera other than the Alpha 850 or 900 with a 300mm lens, you're going to be getting 10 times more magnification and 10 times more chance of camera shake. So use your shutter to try and help minimize the chance of camera shake. There's a rule of thumb that says your shutter speed should be at least equal to the focal length of lens you're using. So with the 300mm lens, you should be at minimum using a 2/50th of a second, preferably take it up a little bit higher to a 500th of a second if you want to avoid camera shake. Alternatively, mount the camera on a tripod. You're guaranteed to get better results that way. Your aperture controls the thing which we call depth of field in photography. Now, depth of field is the area in front and behind where you focused on your subject that will be in focus. Remember, we spoke about apertures being a little bit back to front. The bigger the number, the wider the opening of the aperture. So example, on this 16mm lens on this NEX-C3, the wide opening is 2.8. So we've got a 2.8 aperture. We take that number down to f16 and we're getting a smaller opening. Okay, remember it's a fraction. So 1/16 is smaller than 1/2.8. Now, what we need to remember when we're doing this is that the bigger the opening, the light is, or the depth of field is going to be shallower. And we've got a couple of examples here shot at f2.8 where you can see a range of the books that are not quite blurred except for the area where we focused. At f8, an increased amount of depth of field, and then at f16 where we've got an even greater amount of depth of field. So the more the aperture is closed down, the less light is entering the lens, the slower our shutter speed is going to be, but the more depth we're going to have in our photograph. To offset the chance of camera shake, you may be tempted to go and quickly increase your ISO as we stop the aperture down and get to slower shutter speeds. Now, the danger in doing that is your ISO has an effect on the image quality in what we call noise or digital grain. You may have seen photographs taken in low light conditions where the picture looks really grainy and it's all blotchy. That is noise, and that has an impact on the way that the image is going to come out. Now, if you're photographing to make a great picture, you want to blow it up large, or it's going to be used for commercial purposes, you probably don't want to have that kind of result on your image. So we want to try wherever possible to use the slowest ISO possible. It's important to realize the balancing of these three gets the creative effect you desire. And so being able to understand how they work together and relate together will help improve your photography. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit about the way that your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speeds are controlled by the camera's exposure modes, and the way the camera thinks to try and get what it thinks is a good photograph. And we'll look at how we can take control of the camera and be able to understand the way it thinks and how it gets to its results. Lastly, we want to end off the show with a brief viewer's question. We were asked during this week on Twitter what lens to get, what wide-angle lens to get for an Alpha 200. Now, first of all, we need to define what a wide-angle lens is. You'll remember earlier I mentioned that on a camera like the Alpha 850 or the 900, magnification is different to what it is on the rest of the Alpha range. That's because those cameras have a bigger sensor. Just the same way that the magnification will be different, so is your wide-angle focal length going to be different. When we talk wide, we're talking about any lens that is less than what the standard lens is. On an Alpha 850 or 900 with what we call a full-frame sensor, those cameras will be having a standard lens of a 50mm. On an NEX or on the other Alpha cameras in the range, your standard focal length is about 30mm. Now, that means anything less than 30 is wide, and anything over 30 starts to become a telephoto and goes into the scene. Your standard wide-angle lens, if you can call it that, for most of the compact cameras or compact sensor cameras is that of 18 millimeters. So most of you who've bought your camera as a kit, you would have got the 18 to 55 millimeter lens in the box. 18, that is wide angle, but it's not terribly wide. So if you were looking for something to go wider than that, you're probably looking at something like Sony's 11 to 18. There are also third-party manufacturers who make lenses which go wider. Tamron make a 10 to 24 and Sigma make a 10 to 20. There aren't many choices in terms of really wide-angle lenses. So go out, play with them, get an idea in a good store about how they work on your camera, and then make a decision from there. You can't go wrong. All of them perform pretty well. There aren't mediocre lenses in that range. If you want, the 11 to 18 has been around for a while with Sony, and it is a really good performer. That's it for this particular episode. We'll be back with you in 2 weeks or so, and we'll be chatting a little bit more about the exposure system, the way the camera thinks, and we'll also be looking at some of the new gizmos and gadgets which are being launched there. There's a lot of rumors out on what's new and coming from Sony. So keep your ears open and your eyes open. Keep visiting alphatutorials.co.za and make sure that you contribute there by asking your questions that you have for us. We're glad to receive your questions and answer them. We'll also be posting up more information and exciting news about things that Sony are doing and the way that you can improve your use with your Alpha camera. Till next time, have a good week.